The Dalai Lama as a refugee. Imagine being forced to leave the land of your ancestors, the mountains and valleys that have shaped not only your identity but the spiritual essence of your people. This was the fate of the Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, who fled Tibet in 1959 after the Tibetan uprising against Chinese rule. His journey into exile is not merely a personal story of survival but a symbol of resilience and undying hope for millions. Exiled in Dharamshala, India, he leads the Central Tibetan Administration, often referred to as the Tibetan government in exile. Here, amidst the lush greenery of the Himalayan foothills, he continues to champion the cause of Tibetan autonomy and cultural preservation. But what does it mean to live in exile, to be a spiritual leader without a physical homeland? Exile is not merely about physical displacement. It is a profound rupture that reshapes one's identity and worldview. For the Dalai Lama, exile has become a mission, a bridge between the spiritual and the political. He has transformed his personal loss into a global cause, advocating not only for Tibet but for universal values of compassion, peace, and coexistence. Exile has also amplified his voice, turning him into a global statesman whose message transcends geographic boundaries. Despite the immense personal loss of leaving behind the physical and cultural landscape of his homeland, the Dalai Lama's journey underscores the idea that hope and identity are not confined by borders. Exile has shaped the Dalai Lama's role in profound ways. Living in Dharamshala has allowed him to create a new center of Tibetan culture and spirituality outside Tibet, ensuring its preservation in the face of significant challenges. Dharamshala is not just a political base but a living embodiment of Tibetan resilience and adaptation. Through the Central Tibetan Administration, the Dalai Lama has worked tirelessly to address issues ranging from refugee welfare to global awareness of Tibet's plight. His leadership has inspired generations of Tibetans to maintain their identity and culture while advocating for peaceful dialogue with the Chinese government. His teachings emphasize that exile, though painful, can also be a platform for growth and global influence. By turning his plight into a source of strength, the Dalai Lama reminds the world that displacement does not mean disempowerment. The Dalai Lama's story invites us to reflect on the nature of home. Is it a physical place, or is it the values and connections we carry within us? For millions of Tibetans scattered around the world, home has become an idea rather than a place, a shared heritage rooted in the teachings of Buddhism and the unwavering belief in the possibility of return. This collective longing for a homeland binds the Tibetan diaspora, creating a unique cultural identity that thrives even in the face of displacement. The Dalai Lama's vision extends beyond his people, offering a universal message about resilience, hope, and the ability to find strength in adversity. Historical Tibetan society. The history of pre-1950s Tibet is often painted in contrasting shades. Some describe it as a tranquil theocratic society rooted in Buddhist teachings, where spirituality guided daily life and governance. Others emphasize its feudal system, where serfdom was prevalent, and large estates and monasteries held significant control over resources and labor. Critics point to the hierarchical nature of Tibetan society, where peasants worked under the authority of landowners or monasteries, often in challenging conditions. This includes references to the Dalai Lama's administration, which oversaw vast estates and a network of monastic institutions. However, equating this system with slavery oversimplifies the socio-economic realities of the time. The Chinese government's narrative emphasizes its role in liberating Tibet from feudal oppression, framing its actions as a modernizing force that ended an outdated system. This narrative, however, comes with its contradictions. While economic development and infrastructure improvements have occurred, they have often been accompanied by the erosion of Tibetan cultural and religious identity. Tibetan monasteries, once vibrant centers of learning and spirituality, now operate under strict government control. Traditional Tibetan practices are increasingly overshadowed by policies aimed at integrating Tibetan society into the broader Chinese framework. This dichotomy forces us to grapple with difficult questions. Can economic development justify cultural suppression? Does material progress hold meaning if it undermines a community's spiritual and cultural essence? The history of Tibet reminds us that true progress is holistic, addressing both material needs and the intangible aspects of identity and heritage. The Dalai Lama's leadership in exile serves as a testament to this principle. Despite the challenges, he continues to advocate for a future where economic and cultural preservation coexist, offering a vision that bridges tradition and modernity. In pre-1950s Tibet, the society's complexity was intertwined with its spiritual fabric. Buddhism was not just a religion but a way of life, influencing governance, education, and social values. Monasteries played a dual role as spiritual centers and institutions of power, managing vast lands and resources. While this system provided stability and continuity, it also faced criticism for maintaining social hierarchies. However, the Tibetan worldview, deeply rooted in Buddhist teachings, emphasized harmony, interdependence, and a sense of collective responsibility. These values shaped the Tibetan approach to governance and social organization, creating a unique cultural and spiritual identity that continues to inspire people worldwide. The Chinese intervention in Tibet brought about drastic changes, some of which were framed as necessary reforms. Land redistribution, infrastructure development, and modernization efforts were highlighted as achievements. However, these changes were often accompanied by policies that undermined Tibetan traditions and religious practices. The forced assimilation of Tibetan culture into the Chinese mainstream has been a source of deep resentment and resistance. Despite these challenges, the Tibetan spirit remains unbroken, as seen in the efforts of the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan diaspora to preserve their heritage and advocate for their rights. The Dalai Lama's teachings emphasize the importance of dialogue and mutual understanding. He has consistently called for a middle way approach, advocating for genuine autonomy within China rather than full independence. This pragmatic stance reflects his commitment to peace and reconciliation, even in the face of adversity. His vision for Tibet is one where its rich cultural and spiritual heritage is preserved while embracing the benefits of modernization. This vision offers a blueprint for addressing the challenges of cultural preservation and development in a rapidly changing world. Detailed analysis of key claims. Claim 1. He is used as a tool to disgust Chinese people. This claim encapsulates a perspective commonly promoted in Chinese state media, portraying the Dalai Lama as a separatist figure manipulated by foreign powers to provoke anti-China sentiment. At first glance, such a portrayal might seem convincing to those unfamiliar with the Dalai Lama's background or the broader context of the Tibetan issue. However, upon deeper reflection, the claim raises important questions. Can a spiritual leader, whose teachings revolve around compassion, forgiveness, and interdependence, genuinely be reduced to a mere tool wielded by foreign powers? What implications does such a narrative have for understanding the complexities of Tibet's struggle for cultural preservation and autonomy? The global perspective, a leader beyond borders. The Dalai Lama's role on the global stage transcends the simplistic characterization of him as a political weapon. Over the decades, he has engaged with countless world leaders, delivered lectures to diverse audiences, and participated in global humanitarian initiatives. These efforts consistently emphasize themes such as universal human rights, the value of nonviolence, and the interconnectedness of all beings. His advocacy for Tibet focuses not on independence or separation, but on meaningful autonomy, a position he has reiterated time and again. The Dalai Lama's approach is grounded in principles of coexistence and mutual respect. Far from seeking to disgust or antagonize the Chinese people, his rhetoric often highlights the shared humanity between Tibetans and Chinese, calling for dialogue and understanding. This emphasis on harmony challenges the portrayal of him as a disruptive figure. Instead, his mission aligns with universal concerns, such as preserving cultural heritage, ensuring religious freedom, and advocating for nonviolent solutions to conflict. Undermining agency and oversimplifying complexities. By framing the Dalai Lama as a tool, this narrative denies his personal agency and dismisses the depth of his motivations. Such a perspective reduces a profoundly spiritual and moral figure into a mere puppet of geopolitical interests, stripping away the authenticity of his life's work. Moreover, it trivializes the legitimate aspirations of the Tibetan people, suggesting that their struggle is nothing more than a proxy for foreign intervention. This oversimplification not only misrepresents the Dalai Lama but also ignores the complex and deeply rooted nature of the Tibetan issue. The struggle for Tibetan autonomy encompasses cultural, religious, and historical dimensions that cannot be easily reduced to the binary of China versus the West. To dismiss the Dalai Lama as a tool is to disregard the lived experiences of Tibetans who seek to preserve their identity in the face of rapid modernization and political control. The root of misunderstanding. The perception of the Dalai Lama as a foreign instrument stems from broader anxieties within Chinese political discourse, where external criticism is often interpreted as a threat to national sovereignty. This defensive posture, while understandable in the context of historical experiences, fails to account for the sincerity and consistency of the Dalai Lama's message. His advocacy is not rooted in hostility toward China but in a desire to protect the cultural and spiritual heritage of Tibet within a framework of peaceful coexistence. Critically, the Dalai Lama's calls for autonomy align with the Chinese constitution's own provisions for regional self-governance. His insistence on non-violence and dialogue further demonstrates his commitment to resolving differences without resorting to conflict. These elements challenge the portrayal of him as a figure bent on undermining China's unity and stability. The human dimension, compassion as a driving force. Reducing the Dalai Lama to a political tool also disregards the deeply human and spiritual aspects of his work. His teachings emphasize compassion, forgiveness, and the interconnectedness of all life, values that resonate far beyond the political sphere. For millions around the world, he represents a beacon of hope and wisdom, inspiring individuals to pursue peace and understanding in their own lives. The narrative that frames him as a tool ignores this broader influence, instead confining him to a narrow and adversarial role. It fails to recognize the profound impact of his teachings on fostering global awareness of issues such as mindfulness, interfaith dialogue, and environmental sustainability. These contributions demonstrate that his influence extends far beyond the Tibetan issue, encompassing universal concerns that touch people from all walks of life. The Tibetan struggle, a quest for dignity. Framing the Dalai Lama as a tool not only misrepresents him but also diminishes the Tibetan people's legitimate aspirations. Tibet's struggle is not merely a political issue, it is a deeply human quest for dignity, identity, and cultural survival. The Tibetan people's desire for autonomy reflects their commitment to preserving their unique heritage in the face of profound challenges. By portraying the Dalai Lama as a pawn in a larger geopolitical game, this narrative undermines the authenticity of the Tibetan cause. It shifts attention away from the substantive issues at stake, such as the preservation of Tibetan language, religion, and way of life. These concerns are not abstract or ideological but deeply personal and rooted in the lived experiences of countless individuals. A call for nuance and understanding. In rejecting the narrative that reduces the Dalai Lama to a mere tool, we are invited to engage with a richer and more nuanced understanding of his role. His efforts are not about disgusting or antagonizing any nation or people. Instead, they reflect a commitment to universal principles of compassion, justice, and mutual respect. His advocacy challenges us to look beyond simplistic narratives and engage with the complexities of the Tibetan issue in a spirit of open-mindedness and empathy. The portrayal of the Dalai Lama as a tool to disgust Chinese people is not only reductive but also fundamentally misrepresents the nature of his work and the aspirations of the Tibetan people. By examining his teachings, actions, and motivations, it becomes clear that his mission is one of bridge building, not division. His calls for autonomy, cultural preservation, and non-violence resonate with universal values that transcend political boundaries. To understand the Dalai Lama's role is to embrace a deeper awareness of the interconnectedness of all humanity and the shared challenges we face in building a more compassionate and just world. Claim 2. He can't come back to China unless he can confess for his rebellion. This statement serves as a summary of the Chinese government's entrenched position toward the Dalai Lama, illustrating a rigid narrative that frames the Tibetan spiritual leader as a dissident whose return hinges on an acknowledgement of guilt. On the surface, it appears to be a straightforward demand for accountability. Yet, when examined more deeply, it reveals significant complexities about the nature of reconciliation, sovereignty, and identity. Beijing has repeatedly insisted that the Dalai Lama must recognize Tibet as an inseparable part of China and abandon any advocacy for independence. However, such demands provoke crucial questions. Does this condition facilitate true reconciliation between China and Tibet, or does it enforce submission disguised as harmony? The Middle Way approach, an alternative vision. The Dalai Lama has long championed the Middle Way approach, which offers a vision that is neither separatist nor entirely assimilationist. Instead, it seeks genuine autonomy for Tibet within the constitutional framework of the People's Republic of China. Central to this approach is the preservation of Tibetan culture, religion, language, and way of life, elements that Tibetans consider indispensable to their identity. By proposing this solution, the Dalai Lama emphasizes coexistence and mutual respect, aiming to reconcile Tibet's unique heritage with its political realities under Chinese governance. However, Beijing's demand for a confession introduces a deeply problematic dimension to the conversation. To confess implies an admission of guilt, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing that undermines the legitimacy of the grievances the Tibetan people have expressed for decades. The Dalai Lama's advocacy, rooted in principles of non-violence and dialogue, challenges this framing. It raises a profound question: what constitutes rebellion? Is the defense of cultural survival and self-determination inherently rebellious, or is it a universal right protected under international norms? The Middle Way approach forces us to reconsider the labels of rebellion and loyalty. By advocating for dignity and identity within an established political framework, the Dalai Lama's vision transcends simplistic binaries. It reflects a desire not for separation but for recognition, a call for China to honor its commitments to human rights and autonomy in a manner that does not undermine its sovereignty. Reconciliation or submission? For reconciliation to have meaning, it must be built on foundations of mutual understanding, respect, and compromise. It cannot emerge from conditions that demand unilateral capitulation. Beijing's insistence that the Dalai Lama confess to rebellion and renounce his calls for Tibetan autonomy skews the reconciliation process. Rather than fostering dialogue, such demands entrench the power dynamics that have long characterized the Sino-Tibetan relationship. Confession, as demanded by the Chinese government, imposes a one-sided narrative of guilt and subordination. It positions the Dalai Lama as the sole party responsible for tensions between Tibet and China, while neglecting the historical and systemic factors that have fueled Tibetan grievances. The destruction of monasteries, suppression of religious practices, and erosion of Tibetan cultural identity are not isolated incidents, they are part of a broader historical trajectory that cannot be dismissed. Asking the Dalai Lama to confess disregards this context, reducing the complexities of the Tibetan struggle to an oversimplified narrative of rebellion and punishment. Forgiveness and mutual accountability. The Dalai Lama's teachings on forgiveness offer an important lens through which to view this impasse. As a global advocate of peace and nonviolence, he often emphasizes that forgiveness is essential for healing. However, forgiveness, in its truest sense, requires mutual recognition of harm and a shared commitment to moving forward. It is not synonymous with submission, nor does it demand that one party forfeit its dignity or identity. By framing reconciliation as contingent upon the Dalai Lama's confession, Beijing risks undermining the very principles of forgiveness and healing that could pave the way for a lasting resolution. The Dalai Lama's willingness to engage in dialogue, despite decades of exile and the marginalization of his people, reflects a profound commitment to reconciliation. Yet, reconciliation cannot be achieved in an environment where one party's voice is silenced, and its demands are dismissed as illegitimate. True healing requires a bilateral process in which both sides acknowledge past harms and seek a path forward that respects the dignity of all involved. The broader implications of rebellion. The framing of the Dalai Lama's advocacy as rebellion raises broader questions about the nature of dissent and the limits of state authority. In modern political discourse, rebellion is often associated with violent insurrection or attempts to overthrow a government. The Dalai Lama's approach, by contrast, has been entirely non-violent, rooted in dialogue, and guided by principles of compassion and justice. Is it fair, then, to equate his efforts with rebellion? Or does such a characterization serve to delegitimize the legitimate aspirations of the Tibetan people? The Chinese government's insistence on viewing the Dalai Lama's advocacy through the lens of rebellion obscures the broader context of Tibetan grievances. It reduces a multifaceted struggle for cultural survival, religious freedom, and human rights to a simplistic narrative of insubordination. In doing so, it risks alienating not only the Tibetan people but also the global community, which increasingly recognizes the universality of the principles the Dalai Lama represents. The path forward. If reconciliation is to be achieved, it must move beyond the constraints of confession and submission. It requires a paradigm shift in how both parties approach the issue. For Beijing, this means recognizing the Dalai Lama's middle way approach as an opportunity rather than a threat. Genuine autonomy within the framework of the Chinese constitution offers a way to address Tibetan grievances without compromising China's territorial integrity. It provides a model for coexistence that respects the diversity of China's cultural and ethnic landscape. For the Dalai Lama and his supporters, the path forward lies in continuing to advocate for dialogue and mutual understanding. This includes resisting the pressures to conform to conditions that undermine their dignity while remaining steadfast in their commitment to nonviolence and compassion. By emphasizing the principles of forgiveness and coexistence, the Dalai Lama can continue to serve as a bridge between Tibet and China, offering a vision of reconciliation that transcends political divisions. The Chinese government's condition that the Dalai Lama confess for his rebellion encapsulates a deeper struggle over identity, sovereignty, and reconciliation. At its core, this demand reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of the Dalai Lama's advocacy and the aspirations of the Tibetan people. True reconciliation cannot be achieved through conditions that demand submission. Instead, it requires a willingness to engage in dialogue, acknowledge past harms, and build a future based on mutual respect and understanding. The Dalai Lama's middle way approach offers a pathway to such reconciliation. By prioritizing autonomy over independence and emphasizing coexistence over confrontation, it provides a framework for addressing Tibetan grievances while respecting China's sovereignty. However, for this vision to become a reality, both sides must commit to a process of dialogue and mutual recognition. Only then can the impasse encapsulated in Claim 2 be transformed into an opportunity for healing and harmony. Claim 3. Tibetans live a life better than any time ever. On the surface, this claim highlights the economic and social development brought to Tibet under Chinese governance. Improved infrastructure, healthcare, and education are undeniable achievements. But can material progress alone define a better life? Beyond material prosperity, economic statistics tell only part of the story. While literacy rates and life expectancy have improved, many Tibetans express concerns about the erosion of their cultural identity. Policies promoting Mandarin over Tibetan, restrictions on religious practices, and the relocation of nomadic communities are seen as existential threats to their heritage. True well-being encompasses more than material comforts. It includes the freedom to live authentically, to honor one's traditions, and to pass them on to future generations. Cultural identity at the crossroads. Tibet's rich cultural and religious heritage, centered on Tibetan Buddhism, forms the heart of its people's identity. The promotion of Mandarin as the dominant language in schools has raised fears of a gradual fading of the Tibetan language. Language is more than a tool for communication, it is a vessel for history, tradition, and the unique worldview of a community. A decline in its use represents not just a linguistic loss but a weakening of a people's sense of self. Similarly, religious practices, deeply interwoven with Tibetan life, face challenges. Reports of restrictions on monastic activities, the monitoring of religious figures, and constraints on spiritual gatherings have led many to question whether economic advancements can compensate for the curtailment of spiritual freedoms. For Tibetans, spirituality is not a compartmentalized aspect of life, it is a foundation that supports their values, sense of purpose, and communal bonds. Nomadic communities, between progress and displacement. The relocation of nomadic communities to urbanized settings is another contentious aspect of development. Proponents argue that this move provides better access to healthcare, education, and modern amenities. However, critics highlight the loss of traditional livelihoods and the psychological toll of displacement. Nomadic life, rooted in a deep connection to the land and a sustainable way of living, is not easily replaced by apartment buildings and new job opportunities. For many, these changes signal a loss of autonomy and a detachment from ancestral roots. True well-being, a balance between modernity and tradition. Progress is not an either-or proposition. Economic growth and cultural preservation need not be mutually exclusive goals. True well-being encompasses material prosperity as well as the ability to maintain and celebrate one's heritage. A better life is one where individuals can enjoy improved healthcare and education while also retaining the freedom to express their identity, practice their beliefs, and live in harmony with their traditions. The challenge lies in finding a balance, ensuring that the tangible benefits of modernization do not come at the expense of the intangible elements that define a people's essence. Only by addressing both sides of this equation can the claim that Tibetans live a life better than any time ever hold true in its fullest sense. Claim 4. Nobody can make them as slaves again. This assertion by the Chinese government underscores the abolition of the feudal system in Tibet, a narrative frequently promoted as a cornerstone of their intervention in the region. While this claim resonates with the theme of liberation, it often oversimplifies the complex socio-economic structures of pre-1950s Tibet and raises questions about the nature of freedom and autonomy under the current governance. Historical context and the feudal system in Tibet. The pre-1950s Tibetan society was indeed hierarchical, characterized by a system where landowners and monasteries held significant power, and a portion of the population worked as serfs under obligations of labor or goods. However, equating this structure with outright slavery, as practiced in other parts of the world, such as the transatlantic slave trade, can be misleading. Slavery typically involves the outright ownership of individuals, stripping them entirely of personal agency. In Tibet, while serfs were bound by duty to their landowners, they also had reciprocal rights and obligations rooted in Buddhist principles and cultural traditions. Tibetan scholars argue that this system, though inequitable, cannot be fully understood outside its historical and cultural context. Religious values often shaped the interactions between landowners, monasteries, and their dependents. For instance, many of the ruling elite were monastic institutions, which used their wealth not only for sustenance but also for community support, education, and spiritual guidance. Modern implications of liberation. The Chinese government claims to have liberated the Tibetan people from this feudal system, bringing them into a modern socialist framework. Physical serfdom, as it existed, may indeed have ended, but liberation is a multifaceted concept. Critics argue that the modern governance of Tibet has introduced new forms of control, which undermine the claim of complete freedom. Surveillance and suppression. One prominent critique concerns the extensive surveillance network in Tibet, which has been described as one of the most comprehensive in the world. Cameras, checkpoints, and mandatory monitoring of mobile communications create an environment where dissent is stifled and self-expression is curtailed. Reports from human rights organizations suggest that individuals who express Tibetan identity or criticize government policies risk imprisonment or re-education, raising concerns about whether true freedom has been realized. Cultural and religious restrictions. Freedom also encompasses the ability to practice one's religion and preserve cultural identity. Many Tibetans view these aspects as integral to their sense of self. However, restrictions on religious practices, such as limitations on the veneration of the Dalai Lama, demolitions of religious institutions, and the control of monastic education, suggest that liberation from one form of hierarchy may have been replaced by another form of domination. Beyond the absence of bondage. True freedom extends beyond merely abolishing a feudal system. It encompasses the right to live with dignity, express one's identity without fear, and actively participate in shaping one's community and future. Dignity and economic opportunities. Economic development is often presented as evidence of progress in Tibet. Infrastructure projects, tourism, and modernization have undoubtedly transformed the region. However, these changes are often criticized for disproportionately benefiting non-Tibetan settlers or state-backed entities, while many Tibetans remain in marginal roles. The loss of traditional livelihoods and the forced resettlement of nomadic communities further exacerbate concerns about whether this progress is inclusive or sustainable. Identity and community. The suppression of Tibetan language in schools and public life erodes a cornerstone of cultural identity. While Mandarin Chinese is emphasized as a unifying language, the marginalization of Tibetan undermines efforts to preserve a distinct cultural heritage. For many Tibetans, this linguistic erosion represents a deeper loss of autonomy and self-determination. A question of fulfillment. The claim that nobody can make them as slaves again invites a critical examination of what constitutes true liberation. While the abolition of feudal practices marks a significant historical shift, the ongoing realities of surveillance, cultural suppression, and economic inequality prompt a deeper question. Has the promise of freedom been fully realized in modern Tibet? Freedom is not merely the absence of bondage but the presence of opportunity, dignity, and autonomy. For the Tibetan people, the journey toward achieving these ideals remains fraught with challenges, suggesting that the narrative of liberation is far more complex than it might initially appear. Broader themes and implications. Freedom and identity. Freedom transcends political frameworks, delving into the personal and spiritual realms of human experience. The Dalai Lama's life is a testament to this profound understanding. Even as an exiled leader separated from his homeland, he embodies an unshakable inner freedom that emanates through his teachings, actions, and presence. This freedom is not born from external circumstances but is cultivated through compassion, wisdom, and an unyielding spiritual discipline. It prompts a reflection: how can individuals nurture inner freedom in the face of external challenges? The Dalai Lama's journey inspires us to look within, suggesting that true liberation lies in transcending ego-driven desires and embracing interconnectedness. His life illustrates that freedom is as much a personal endeavor as it is a collective aspiration, encouraging us to seek balance between the two. Progress and preservation. The struggle between advancing modernization and preserving cultural heritage is a dilemma faced by societies worldwide. Tibet's story is a vivid example of this tension. On one hand, economic development and infrastructure promise a better material quality of life. On the other, they threaten to dismantle centuries-old traditions, values, and spiritual practices that define a community's identity. The Dalai Lama's advocacy highlights a critical question: what is the cost of progress if it comes at the expense of erasing the unique threads of a culture's fabric? His perspective urges global leaders and individuals alike to rethink development, emphasizing a holistic approach that integrates economic growth with respect for cultural and spiritual dimensions. By prioritizing preservation alongside progress, societies can create a future where modernity does not necessitate the loss of heritage but becomes a vehicle for its enrichment. The power of dialogue. In a world rife with polarization and ideological clashes, the Dalai Lama's unwavering belief in the power of dialogue emerges as a beacon of hope. His approach transcends mere negotiation. It is rooted in genuine understanding, compassion, and the recognition of shared humanity. He demonstrates that even the most intractable conflicts can be approached with patience and open-heartedness, fostering solutions that respect all parties involved. Through his emphasis on dialogue, the Dalai Lama challenges us to rethink how we address disputes, whether on a global scale or within personal relationships. His teachings suggest that dialogue is not just a tool for conflict resolution but a practice of empathy that builds bridges across divides. In this light, his advocacy becomes a call to action for individuals and societies to cultivate spaces where differences are not just tolerated but embraced as opportunities for growth and unity. Conclusion: a universal reflection. The story of Tibet and the Dalai Lama transcends national borders and political ideologies. It serves as a timeless reminder of resilience and the enduring spirit of what it means to preserve identity in the face of overwhelming odds. This story not only chronicles the challenges of a specific culture but also resonates with universal themes of human endurance, moral courage, and the pursuit of truth. Can we find ways to balance progress with preservation? In a rapidly globalizing era, where technological advancements often come at the cost of cultural erosion and environmental degradation, this question resonates far beyond Tibet. It challenges us to rethink development, not merely as economic growth but as a holistic process that honors tradition, respects diversity, and ensures sustainability. Are we willing to see the other not as an enemy but as a fellow human being? The Dalai Lama's philosophy emphasizes compassion, empathy, and understanding as antidotes to hatred and conflict. This perspective is especially relevant in a world rife with polarization, where differences in ideology, religion, and nationality are often weaponized. Can we transcend these divisions to recognize the shared humanity that unites us? And most importantly, can we embrace compassion as a guiding principle in our interactions? Compassion, as championed by the Dalai Lama, is not a passive sentiment but an active force capable of transforming societies. It calls for deliberate action, extending kindness to those who suffer, advocating for justice, and nurturing relationships based on mutual respect. As we ponder these questions, let us draw inspiration from the Dalai Lama's profound simplicity: the purpose of our lives is to be happy. This statement, though seemingly simple, carries a profound truth about the essence of human existence. It challenges us to redefine happiness, not as a fleeting emotion tied to material success but as a deeper, enduring state of being grounded in inner peace, connection, and love. In seeking this shared happiness, we may not only discover solutions to the challenges facing Tibet but also uncover deeper truths about our own humanity. Perhaps the story of Tibet is not just about a nation's struggle but also about the possibilities that emerge when we collectively commit to values like compassion, resilience, and understanding. It is a mirror held up to the world, reflecting both its struggles and its potential for growth. Let this reflection inspire us to act, not just for Tibet but for all who face oppression, injustice, and marginalization. In championing these values, we honor the essence of the Dalai Lama's teachings and move closer to building a world where happiness is not a privilege for the few but a shared right for all.